Okay, so here we are with our second video. So this is going to be an introduction looking at the grotesque and hopefully seeing how some of these ideas fit in with the two stories that we looked at this week, which is Flannery O'Connor's Parker's Back and Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Birthmark. So what is the grotesque? That is our first question, and we're going to look at a whole bunch of different images. Feel free to pause this video at any point to be able to get a closer look. If you're curious about what some of the images are because they're not sourced, feel free to contact me or Irv, and we'd be able to give you a bit more information about them if you're interested in looking at them further. So what I was going to do with you guys in class was similarly have you guys pause for about 30 to 60 seconds and think about, what do you think the grotesque is, just based on the word itself, what you know about it, maybe because we're asking you this question in the context of these stories, but to just take that moment to pause and think about that. What is your concept about what you think the grotesque might be? And then I was going to have you share with the person sitting next to you. That probably won't work. So I'll share a little bit with you guys. So first off, the grotesque is a literary device that is used to create dissonance. So dissonance is this, often it's a term used in music actually, where you have two notes played together that don't sound quite right, or they have this feeling of like there's something off. There's something not exactly fitting or not exactly right. And so with the grotesque, it's meant to create dissonance, particularly linked to the body, so the physical being. And often this will be in the context of images of death, images of deformity, of unusual situations, of physical illness, things like that. But it also focuses on displacement within, with the effect of the uncanny. So that fits with that dissonance, uncanny being something's not quite right, or it's a little off or a little interesting in that sense. And in all of this, us as whether viewers or readers or whatever the medium is, we're being forced to look at something or experience something that is not beautiful. And so that's a really important part of the grotesque. So looking at some sourcing or looking at the history of the grotesque and how it's been used in other art forms, especially within with paintings and artwork. A history of where this came from is actually from Sebastian Münster in 1544. He's a German writer. And he wrote the Cosmographia, which is a history of the world. And now thinking about 1544, so this is hundreds of years ago, coming from this German writer's perspective, you can see the photo here, which is taken directly from his work. He was looking at the world from a very different perspective. And I have another scholar, MacLean, who says of Münster's Cosmographia that within it, he's looking towards the margins of the world. So that means like far outside of what was known or what was considered common day experience. So within the German community, what was known within their own context, within their own cultural mindset, within their own experience. Münster was looking outside of that. And so the Cosmographia, it will describe the quicksands in Russia or the great sandstorms of Arabia, which rose as high as mountains to suffocate travelers, and shifting deserts in Africa, which change swiftly and submerge and kill living things. So he is writing of this world that his readers would have known not of. And it was this distant, this uncomfortable otherness that he was talking about. And the idea was, and this is from MacLean, the further one moves out from the civilized German epicenter of Münster's world towards the fringes, it would seem the more hostile the earth becomes and the more stark the aberrations of the created earth, human, animal, and environmental appear to be. So this is the beginning of this idea of things being uncomfortable, this dissonance, this separateness, this feeling of other that makes us uncomfortable. And as you can see in the image on the PowerPoint there, there's bodies that don't look quite right, or there's the head of an animal on the body of a man, or a being with a single eye instead of two eyes, or two heads instead of one, or a giant foot. So there's this otherness, this grotesque idea that was separate, that was different from what was known. And Munster was almost this starting point in what became a literary tradition on its own. So within art, there's Salvador Dali as someone that is fairly well recognized for being a surrealist painter. And so the surrealism is this idea that it's super real, or it's beyond real. And in this painting, you can see here, there are aspects of reality. We've got mountains, we've got water and land and sky the way that they normally would appear to us. And yet there are things that are not quite right, that make us uncomfortable with the shape of the clocks. And there's this distortion happening in his paintings. And as you can see the note there, that surrealism plays with the grotesque. It's making us uncomfortable and looking beyond what we're used to. Then we've got some other paintings here, and like I said, feel free to pause. This is also by Salvador Dali, but you can see things in this painting that are unfamiliar, that make us, hopefully, I would assume, uncomfortable. But the idea being that in our discomfort, in being exposed to something that is different from our reality, we are going to pause and think and maybe notice things that we wouldn't have noticed before, or see something in our own reality through this painting that we wouldn't have seen before. And another here. I spent quite a bit of time looking at this photo actually, and asking myself what made me uncomfortable about some of these paintings. What were the things that I didn't like, or the things that felt off to me? And I would encourage you to do the same. What is it about something like this that makes you feel uncomfortable? Edvard Munch, so his painting The Scream is also exploring, or within the artistic tradition of the grotesque, and experiencing something that is dissonant, that is off-putting, and in a very different style from Dali, as we can see, and yet there is still that exploration happening here. Feel free to pause and look at the painting a bit longer. So Impressionism, this is Starry Night, which is a very famous painting, and often not one considered uncomfortable or making us uncomfortable in any ways, unless you can see the note there, it's distorting. And so this is a great question to ask, especially for a painting like this. Are there things that are distorted in this, or in a painting like this? And what does that distortion cause in us as viewers? What are the ways that we look at this painting that create that dissonance? And maybe it's a pleasant dissonance. Dissonance isn't always unpleasant, though there might be even some sort of physical, visceral experience to that dissonance. But what do we see that's distorted, that causes us to look at this painting and then hopefully subsequently the reality it's portraying, or the reality we connect it to, in a different way? So realism focuses on the real, not distortion. So this sculpture here, we can see very clearly, it looks realistic. It's the sculpture of a man. It's very comfortable in that it's familiar, we understand it, we relate to it. That doesn't mean we're not going to be inspired to think or feel certain ways, but realism is doing something different than what the grotesque is seeking to do as a point of comparison. So Da Vinci, he loved looking for images that were unique, and I would assume for most of us, especially the picture on the left-hand side, is creating a sense of dissonance and a sense of discomfort. There are things that are familiar, and yet they're being paired with things that are unfamiliar, and that makes us feel uncomfortable. And I'm going to go through a series of sketches that Da Vinci had that are highlighting elements of human beings that are unique, that are looking at maybe highlighting certain features that are not always highlighted, or looking at things that are not always looked at. So I'll go through each one. I won't comment on each, but I will leave some time if you would like to pause and look at each image in your own time. So each of those is looking at a different element of what it means to be human, or at least a different element that Da Vinci was focusing on. And historically speaking, we don't know if these are people he was actually sketching that he knew, or if these were just images in his mind that he was bringing out onto paper. But there's definitely this focus on something that's not necessarily pleasing to look at, or something that's not beautiful, which would lend it towards this understanding of the grotesque. So Giuseppe Arcimboldo, if I pronounced that correctly, his paintings were looking at this idea of humans but mutated. So there was something that was wrong, or something that was off. If we look at this painting here, I think it's fairly obvious that this is a photo, or an image of a man, and yet it's made up of non-human objects, and specifically sort of fruits and vegetables in this case. And so you're welcome to pause here if you want to look a bit more closely at this image, but I'm going to go and zoom in a little bit, where we can start to see now this distortion. The closer we go in, the more distorted it feels. There's this greater dissonance. And we're going to zoom in one more time. At this point, I don't know about you, but for me, I'm almost able to step back and actually remove this larger whole, that this was a man in the first place, and just start to see the individual parts. And it's creating this sense of dissonance. It's creating this sense that what I'm looking at is not quite human, is not what I initially thought it was. Another image is this one. Now, I've spent quite a bit of time looking at this photo, or at this painting, and now have a hard time seeing the whole. So I encourage you to pause and take a moment. What is the larger picture that we're seeing here with this painting? What is the collection of images seeking to make as a whole? And also feel free to try and dissect it a little bit. But at this point, I'm going to zoom in. So we've zoomed into one part of the painting where it becomes so much clearer. The animals are put together, and you can see almost this interaction going on between them, and it's not all pleasant, and it's definitely not all beautiful. And you can see the ways they're intertwined, where it's actually hard to see at different points, where some end and some begin. And we're going to zoom into one other part of this painting. Oh, looking at the eyes, my goodness. Anyways, and then there's one other element of the painting that maybe you didn't notice at the beginning that we're going to zoom in on. So just see how you feel as you are looking at these images. What does it evoke in you physically? Where do you experience some of maybe the discomfort or dissonance? And what are some of the things that you think as you look through these portraits? And we'll continue on. So part of the grotesque is looking at the netherworld, or the underworld, or the demon world, which is coming right back to the Cosmographia and Münster that we talked about at the beginning. And this is also coming within the Gothic tradition. Looking at combining human with the inhuman is part of that experience. And you can see these two gargoyles that are on different cathedrals throughout the world, just to see how prolific some of these images were through that Gothic period. And so here are some other images of this blending of human and non-human. Feel free to pause if you would like to look longer. See if there are images that stand out more to you, and ask yourself maybe why they stood out to you, what you were experiencing, and why they made you feel a certain way. So the grotesque, kind of summing up some of these things, it resists interpretation. And I tried my best not to necessarily seek to interpret some of those pieces of art, but to let them whether speak for themselves or be experienced unto themselves. And that doesn't mean you can't seek to find your own understanding, your own experience within it, but there's this lack of reason or understanding that comes with them. They highlight incongruences, and that's that feeling of being off, of things not quite right. And not only are they present in this art form, but they're highlighted, they're emphasized. Engaging in contradictions, which really comes out when we see this blend of human and non-human imagery, and other forms. Maybe you notice those contradictions throughout some of the other images. It remains discordant, and that's such an important piece, this idea that we're feeling uncomfortable. And similarly, it confuses. So we're not necessarily just uncomfortable physically as we see images that are not pleasant or images that make us uncomfortable, but they mentally confuse us, and we might be trying to understand why certain things are together or what's going on. And that goes back to resisting interpretation, because there's this sense of lacking meaning or lacking understanding that we often crave as human beings. Creates distinction between art and subject. And I think one of the great examples of this was that image of all of the animals, where it actually became hard to see the subject because there's this distinction between the art and those animal pieces altogether. Maybe you feel there is another painting that even better exhibits this distinction. It disrupts the relationship between art and the meaning of art. And we do ask ourselves, what is the purpose of these paintings? What is the purpose of art when we're looking at something that isn't pleasing us, that isn't pleasant? What is the relationship then between art and the meaning of art? And grotesque ornament recognizes and resists the sense of meaning. So some of these pieces are even seeking to create such dissonance and discomfort to the point of not having meaning, not having that greater understanding. So taking these ideas of the grotesque, let's look a little bit deeper then at our story specifically. So O'Connor she's such a great author to explore the grotesque within her writing. So her art is firmly in visible world of reality and the invisible world of reality. So the key things to notice in this statement. So visible world of lowercase reality, and the difference between that and the invisible world of uppercase reality. So how does she take the very physical, visceral, human experience, which is what we see and experience with our senses, seeing, taste, touch, smell, feel, etc., compared with the invisible world of capital R reality, of the things going on that we can't see. And she is coming from a religious tradition, a Catholic tradition. So how does that influence what's happening to her characters and what's going on in her stories? Where all reference are split, nothing is unified or pure. And so we see this separation of things that we wouldn't normally see separated, which does create tension within us, because we see things that are supposed to be together, be united, and pure, and they're not. Now, O'Connor was also looking at this from within the context of the human experience and saying, we're told these certain things about what it means to be human within our religious traditions, and she starts to pull these apart. And so sometimes I think as a reader, we actually experience maybe even a sense of I don't want to say ease, because I don't think O'Connor creates ease, but a sense of truth, because she's taken something that we've been told is a whole, but the human experience has told us that they're actually separate, and she explores that, though she often does it in a way that still makes us uncomfortable and puts us in a position of dissonance or discomfort. Her subject, so the almost imperceptible intrusions of grace in territory held largely by the devil. So there's that dissonance right there. Territory held largely by the devil, but imperceptible intrusions of grace. How can those two things be present together, exist together? They're not unified. They certainly aren't pure, but they are present in a tension together. And O'Connor's grotesque art recognizes the realities people see as well as the realities they don't see. And that comes back to this idea of the visible world and the invisible world and how they fit together. So a little bit more about the grotesque. So Kant, he's an interesting person to bring into this, a philosopher who had high taste and utter tastelessness. He was looking at this different human experience and aesthetics and what is beauty and how do we understand these things. Preeminently the art of disgust, which feels like an oxymoron, art and disgust, that they would be together, and yet that was something he was exploring. Hegel, discontinuity between spirit and form. So he's also looking at this separateness between the invisible and the visible, and how those two fit in tension together or don't fit in tension together. Ruskin was another artist and philosopher who he was looking at dualism, and so somehow stands for the essence both of human creation and human degradation, the noble and ignoble. So dualism being that there are these two parts, and it's either one or the other, but not both. And the true grotesque is the serious mind. The false grotesque is the frivolous mind. And art has both the power to ennoble and degrade, that it can do both. And even that he's breaking the grotesque down further. And in some of the readings that I did on Ruskin, that he was also looking at how we can understand the grotesque. And one of the things that I found was he looked at the grotesque as a way of understanding that which enables terrible things to be set out in the open and to be played with in a form of personal and cultural exorcism. So that's a really strong statement. But he was seeking to understand the grotesque and what it says about our human experience as individuals and on a societal level, a cultural level, and what is being exorcised from us through that process, what is coming out of us when we look at the grotesque. So here's a little bit more about Ruskin, and Irv shared this quotation. This proximity to a unified source compelled Ruskin always to be, if not respectful, at least humble before the awesome power of the grotesque, which was capable of bringing mankind near to God, or bestial cretinism. So there's that dualism again, either being brought near to God, so elevated, holy, good, or bestial cretinism, which was below, which was negative, which was less than human. And so there's this separation and this dualistic idea of direction that the grotesque, Ruskin felt, would bring out of the human experience and give us the ability to see in ourselves and see in humanity. So what is our reaction? How do you respond to this? What is your way of understanding these ideas, the visual images? We're talking about these in the context of stories as well, especially O'Connor. So the written experience and the way we read the grotesque. Now this, maybe you don't feel the same way. Maybe you don't seek to renounce the grotesque. Maybe you have a different experience. Maybe your dissonance isn't quite the same as maybe mine was or someone else's. But often for humans, we want to renounce the grotesque. We want beautiful things. If we look at Hollywood, we see how beautiful our actors and actresses are, the images that we see there. We want to see beautiful things. We don't want ugly. We don't want grotesque. We want complete circles. So we want this idea that we want things to conclude. We want them to be complete. We want them to be whole. And the grotesque pushes back on that. We don't want discordant sounds or images. We want a song to end on the right notes. We don't want that dissonance. We want order and structure. Though we also want kitsch, this denial of truth, because we want beautiful things. Sometimes we're unwilling to explore the darkness or the grotesque and the parts of ourselves, the parts of humanity that are not beautiful. And there's a lot of us, a lot in us that's not beautiful. And so that we would deny that truth and instead choose kitschy things, choose things that hide that are not as whole, are not as beautiful, because they lack some of that darkness. But through this all, that dissonance leads to discovery. And I hope that through some of those paintings, some of the images, that you are finding that there's something to be discovered. There's something that you're noticing in yourself, in your own reactions, in the way that it's helping you see things a little bit differently, that there's this exploration occurring and this discovery both of self and of other. And so I encourage you with that, even if you want to go back and look through some of those, rewind to different points and see what you notice in some of those elements and the way you notice yourself through them. And so I'm going to pause this video here. There's a few other things I want to share before we go into the stories, but I'll do that in a separate video. And I just really encourage you to take a little bit of time to pause and notice your own experience and your own reactions, and to think about them for a little bit and what that says about you and where you are in your life right now and your own experience of beauty and of grotesque.